All right, guys. So Mr. Hudeberg here with my nerdy headset on, but we're going to talk about carbon and specifically the forms carbon takes and where carbon goes into and out of the geosphere, right? So this is a geochemical cycle, right? And like I said, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. I want to orient you guys to a few things before we delve into the nitty gritty uh, of the carbon cycle. So the way I've drawn this for you as a start. So I'm going to encourage you guys to, in a moment, hit pause and just kind of get your page set up for notes. Now you want to draw this large enough so that we can make arrows going in and out, and in order to write on those arrows and label them with some information. Okay. Two, I also recommend that you guys get some colors, right? So different colored pens or colored pencils, however you guys want to do that. It's just going to help make sense of what's going to turn into a sort of a messy picture here shortly. Okay. So um, colors I'm going to use are green and black and red and blue likely. Okay. So at this point, like I said, I would hit pause. Go ahead and draw what you see here, right? Get your colored pens and pencils ready to go. Make it large enough on the paper to include some arrows and labels. All right, I'm going to pretend you just paused and move on. All right, so what we have written down here are different what we call carbon reservoirs, right? So we've got the atmosphere, biomass, the ocean, rocks and sediments, and then I sort of linked the fossil fuels there to our rocks and sediments since they really are locked up. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas are a part of our rock formations essentially. Okay, but I separated them out because there's a really important part of the carbon cycle that specifically involves fossil fuels. Now, what you also see written in the lighter blue here, and I hope you guys can read that on this video, is relative amounts of carbon in what says GT, that's gigatons. So one of the things that's going to be helpful to know, I don't expect my students to memorize the numbers of gigatons of carbon, especially since they're just approximations anyways. But it is good to know kind of the relative amount of carbon. Like where do we find the most carbon? Here, for example, by far the majority of the carbon on the Earth is locked up in rocks and sediments and our fossil fuels, right? The ocean, in terms of our more active carbon, has a lot of carbon. The atmosphere and biomass, while it's still a lot of carbon compared to the other reservoirs, they're relatively small. Okay, so once you have all that in place, we are ready to start throwing some arrows up on this bad boy. Okay, so let's let's do this with the atmosphere. Now, in the atmosphere, right, carbon primarily takes two forms that are important to us at this point. We're going to be carbon dioxide and methane. Now, there are other carbon containing compounds in the atmosphere, but those are our primary two that are important at this stage of the game. All right, so carbon dioxide and methane, they're both clear, colorless, odorless gases, okay, that reside in a variety of quantities in our atmosphere. Now, um, so one of the things we're going to look at is inputs and outputs of carbon into each of these reservoirs. Okay, and what processes cause that, right? And what forms does carbon take as it moves from one reservoir to the next? So we got the forms of carbon dioxide and methane. Now, one of the things we can link carbon dioxide to, is our biomass. So I'm going to draw a nice little black arrow from the atmosphere into our biomass. Now, we should already know at this stage in the game what process moves carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into biomass. And we're going to label that photosynthesis. Okay, so carbon dioxide from the atmosphere gets brought into biomass through the process of photosynthesis, right? Now, once that carbon gets brought into the plants, right? So we talked about it forming glucose as a product of that photosynthesis, but that carbon also gets broken down and then reused to make biomolecules, or the actual stuff that biomass is made of, plants, animals, bacteria, etc. Right? All those molecules that make up that biomass, carbon is a major component of it. Okay? So photosynthesis brings carbon dioxide primarily from the atmosphere into biomass. Now we also learned earlier that this is a cycle, right? And in this cycle, we also have processes that move carbon from the biomass back to the atmosphere, and we refer to that as respiration or cellular respiration to be more specific, right? Now we're going to add the word decomposition to that. All right, so again, depending on your video quality is whether you can read that. So we have respiration and decomposition, which are essentially the same process. We just refer to decomposition when bacteria and fungus do it, decompose dead and organic matter, return that back to the atmosphere. Right, now, we're going to make a little side note here. So we have respiration and decomposition pointing to that carbon dioxide. We can also get methane from that. Okay, and that is when the process is anaerobic, right? So that means there's certain bacteria and or I think it's just bacteria actually, that decompose things anaerobically, right, without the presence of oxygen. And when that happens, rather than producing carbon dioxide, which requires oxygen, we produce methane instead. That's CH4, right? So those are just a couple of processes that interact between the atmosphere and biomass. Now, uh, other processes, right, that interact between the atmosphere and biomass um, and exchange carbon is wildfires. So I'm going to do another red arrow from biomass to the atmosphere. Okay, and here on the West Coast, we are very familiar with wildfires and all that nastiness, but that is another way so when you burn wood, for example, one of the major products is carbon dioxide. So wildfires put, right? We could also add to that one more arrow, deforestation, or land use. So anytime we cut down trees and stuff, we're putting kind of changing that cycle to push more CO2 back to the atmosphere. Right? Now you guys are starting to see what I mean about this getting a little bit messy over time. All right, so we're going to move on to the ocean. All right, so again, we're going to start with our atmosphere. We're going to talk about the exchange of carbon dioxide and methane, but mostly carbon dioxide in the ocean. And so what we get, so I'm going to go back to my black arrow here. So from the atmosphere to the ocean, right? So carbon dioxide is a gas, and water is really good at dissolving things. And so it can actually dissolve carbon dioxide. So we're going to call this process from the atmosphere to the ocean dissolution. All right, where the carbon dioxide actually dissolves into the seawater. Okay, now one of the forms carbon dioxide can take when it's in the ocean is carbonic acid. So that's one of those forms of carbon I told you guys that I wanted you to be aware of. Right. So essentially, we got H2O. We add some CO2 to that. We can form a compound called H2CO3. That is that carbonic acid molecule, right? So dissolving CO2 into water makes the water a little bit more acidic. Now it's actually kind of a weak acid. Now, as that carbonic acid molecule, there's a process called dissociation. You can also produce bicarbonate molecules. Okay, so that is another form. So we got our carbonic acid form, we got a bicarbonate form. Those are two of the many forms that carbon can take when it's in the ocean water. Okay, we'll talk about why that's important here in a little bit. But Um, those are some forms. We have the dissolution. Now, we have the reverse of that dissolution process. So we just put it right back to the atmosphere as X solution. All right, so just like carbon dioxide can dissolve into water, the water can also put the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through that process called X solution. So there's sort of an equilibrium, a dynamic equilibrium going on with the temperature of the ocean and how much CO2 is in the air versus how much goes in versus how much dissolves versus how much exsolves from that process. Okay, so when we dissolve CO2 into water, we produce carbonic acid and sometimes the bicarbonate ion. Okay, now inside the ocean, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. So we've got to remember that there's a ton of biomass in the ocean. So we can go from the ocean to biomass. Here, we'll go a green arrow here. All right, I'm going to get myself a better green marker down the way here. Try that again. All right. In the ocean, we have photosynthesis. Okay. All right. Now, we also have a really important process called shell formation. Okay, so I'm going to make another green arrow here. So there are all kinds of organisms in aquatic ecosystems that actually form shells. Okay, and so one of the forms carbon takes in our biomass, even though the shells themselves are not specifically living because they're made by living organisms, we're going to call them part of that biomass at this point. Other teachers might get mad at me for that. But so in our biomass, we've got our biomolecules. Oops, I should be using my light blue for that, right? Which are variety and too complex to, all right? But we also have calcium carbonate, which is essentially shells. So whether we're talking about coral or clams or lobsters or crabs, etc., those shells, those hard parts on those shells are actually composed almost entirely of calcium carbonate. Okay, now we got a pretty messy carbon cycle going already. All right, so we got inputs and outputs between the atmosphere and biomass, inputs and outputs between the ocean and the atmosphere, and we also have some interaction between biomass and the ocean water itself, right? So that bicarbonate, for example, is a really important piece to forming those carbonate shells. Of course, having some CO2 present helps the photosynthesis occur in the ocean for our aquatic plants as well. Okay, now let's get over here into our rocks and sediments. All right, and then we'll talk about fossil fuels last. So with our rocks and sediments, what we have is a much longer term process. So we're talking on geologic timescales, hundreds of thousands to millions to maybe even tens and hundreds of millions of years, right? For this slow movement of carbon into our rocks and out of our rocks. Okay, so some ways that carbon can get into rocks. One of them is through what's called rock weathering. So I'm going to go from the atmosphere to our rocks. Right. Now, typically the way that happens, certain rocks, not all, but certain rocks. Um, so when rain falls through the atmosphere, we already talked about that dissolution of carbon dioxide into water, right? So the rain actually dissolves some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When that rain falls onto certain types of rocks, a chemical reaction occurs that absorbs some of that CO2 into the chemical structure of those rocks. So we call that rock weathering. It tends to work a little better at higher temperatures. Okay, so we have a rock weathering cycle, right? Now, we're all familiar with volcanic eruptions. Okay. Well, essentially, what happens during a volcanic eruption is we are applying some intense heat to rocks, enough to melt and build up pressure and cause an explosion. But one of the things that happens with the carbon that's in those rocks, a major component of the gases that escape from volcanic eruptions, is in fact carbon dioxide. So I'm going to label this volcanic activity, right? So the intense heat applied to carbon-containing rocks, uh, a lot of that carbon is released when we heat those up, puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere again. In fact, if we go like into deep geologic history, there have been periods of time where the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was several times higher than it is now, right? And those happen to be coincide pretty well with rather intensive volcanic activity that occurred over a long, long periods of time. All right. So we got rock weathering, volcanic activity. Now, um, going from, I'm going to kind of double up. I'm going to go green arrow here. So what we have is calcium carbonate shells. So I'm going to kind of circle these in green a little bit and bicarbonate ions. And we're going to link these carbon containing ions, right, that are either from shells or in our ocean water. And we're going to contribute those, right, to our rocks and sediments. And this is what we call our carbonate rock formation, right? And probably the most common type that you guys would be familiar with is calcium carbonate, which is the same chemical composition as like seashells, but when it's in its rock form, we often refer to it as limestone. All right. Now, if we were to heat that limestone up and kind of squish it under intense pressure, we also form what's called marble, which a lot of people like to use in uh, for countertops and things like that, or sometimes tile. All right. So deep breath here. So we got calcium carbonate, bicarbonate ions, carbonic acid, carbon dioxide, and methane, biomolecules. Glucose would probably be a good one to include in there. Um, all that going on. Now, one of the things we haven't inserted into this picture yet is the human influence on this cycle. Again, that's the whole point of environmental science. How do humans impact global systems, in this case, the carbon cycle? So that's why I separated out this little fossil fuel piece. We could also argue some really important impacts through wildfires and deforestation and land use, but our biggest impact probably comes from right here. And the reason for that is, well, you'll see here in just a second. So basically, we're going to draw an arrow from fossil fuels to the atmosphere. And we're going to label that arrow combustion. Okay. Now, this is the important piece that has everybody in a big kerfuffle these days, is the fact that we're burning fossil fuels at a hugely rapid rate. So again, we talked about these carbonate shells and biomass and through ions in the ocean contributing carbon molecules to our rocks and sediments. Now, um, 300 million years ago, right? Um, these huge fossil fuel formations began forming, right? Uh, because we had certain conditions present, right? But these fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, they take insanely long periods of time to form, just like our rocks do. That rock, anything geologic is slow by our time standards, okay? Fossil fuel formation is an extremely slow process. In fact, organisms have evolved so well now that they probably wouldn't even form any longer because decomposition would be too rapid for it to occur any like it used to anyways. That being said, the only arrow we have associated with fossil fuels is essentially the out arrow. There's nothing really putting carbon back into these fossil fuel reservoirs. Now, the reason that's important is we're taking carbon that was at one point in the atmosphere, ended up getting locked up in rocks and sediments, and essentially stuck there for uh, millions of years. So it's no longer really part of this active cycle. And so what we have is millions, hundreds of millions of years, in fact, of life that is evolved to certain active carbon conditions, right? It's dynamic, right? There's ups and downs that occur naturally, but they're adapted to that, and the climate of our Earth is associated with this processes here. Okay, now what's happening is we're essentially changing the composition of the atmosphere. We're taking these huge, huge storage of carbon that's been locked up in fossil fuels for hundreds of millions of years, and through the combustion process, we're adding a lot more carbon back into the atmosphere. That changes the composition of the atmosphere, right? It changes how much gets dissolved in the ocean to form things like carbonic acid, making the ocean more acidic, right? Yes, it does make more carbon available to our plants for photosynthesis. So some plants might actually benefit, okay? But in this process, we're changing the composition of the atmosphere, and we have no process at our disposal to undo it. All right. And so through this, we're adding more and more carbon to the atmosphere, and that's impacting our other systems, and most importantly to us, and this is what we hear most about, our climate system. Now, how the climate system interplays with carbon dioxide is a topic for another time. All right. But I think we got a more or less complete picture of our carbon cycle, at least for what we need right now. All right. This got a little bit long-winded, 22 minutes, but hopefully we got some working knowledge of how the system works, and we can continue on in class.